I just wanted to say this morning, I found that truly enlightening and encouraging hearing from such prominent professionals navigating options and challenges in the area of research on older persons' needs and rights. And just a little bit about what my role is here. Most of you know it, but not all of you know what I will explain about what I still bring to this, my own personal experience. So my role in all of these trainings, along with 5 others of my colleagues, so to speak, in the home reference group, has been to bring messages of lived experiences to the DRs and include my own in real life situations related to older people's rights. For example, on gaps in navigating the care and housing systems to find affordable and adequate care options for my parents in the US. And that from being far away in Europe. So it was all long distance and online. In any case, I am really fortunate. And then in the US, there are many aging in place services available, but most of them are private. Some of them are nonprofit, which I was also able to achieve for them, but most are private. And just to give you one example, in an emergency situation, my mother needed to stay in a rehabilitation care place for 2 weeks longer than was paid for by insurance. After which, unbeknownst to me, I was presented with a $12,000 bill for 2 weeks in a rehab care place where they were no longer giving her services, which included them not taking her even out of bed, I found out. On the other hand, when she needed out of place housing, I was thrilled to be able to get my mother into or get her to qualify for a program which saved her end of life quality. So she was fortunate, but individuals with less access to people who can tell you about these programs are not so fortunate. My luck and my mother's luck was dependent on one housing director who happened to mention a program, not on a system prepared to inform everyone. This was not a program you could find online. And essentially, I was in the right place at the right time, and that does not happen to the majority of people. So still, my nearly full-time concentration on caring for her over that year ended up costing me my long-time corporate job. And by then, I was 56. So another aspect of ageism. But this led me to become a founder of a startup providing digitalization support to older people, which is my most rewarding work to date. And so the next message for the DRs in these past trainings has been my business experience in the service design, innovation, and co-creation field at the intersection of business, academia, and public policy was the base of my strongest message in the first training. But now I see it's been fully covered by HOMeAGE as well, but it was to make sure that you're aware of the current needs of policymakers, that research can't stay in the clouds or in its own sphere. And if you don't do that before your research topics are chosen, you will have certainly much less impact. But I see, as I mentioned, HOMeAGE has carried this over fantastically, and we're obviously planning it from the beginning. And this is why we're so happy to have Alice Pittini here, Research Director at Housing Europe, where she leads work that connects research evidence with what housing providers and policymakers can actually do at local, national, and EU levels. Housing Europe represents public, cooperative, and social housing providers across Europe and uses research to inform policy and practice. I hope that's right. And Alice, thank you so much for joining us. I'm particularly looking forward to those insights that you're going to provide us, I'm sure, on how to design effective evidence-based responses to housing affordability, availability, and adequacy. So come on up, Alice.
This one? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction, Amanda, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. This is really a great opportunity for me also to learn about the project that you're leading, and on such a important and I would say urgent topic to discuss at all levels, including the European level. So just to start, we'll maybe like this. Nope. We might have just two. Yes. Sorry. My fault, but thank you so much. No, it's off again. Sorry about this.
Yeah, it's turning off again. Maybe the battery is low.
I can also do it by hand.
See, it's working. There should be. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, this is also fine, no problem. So just a few words about Housing Europe, because you might wonder what this organization is actually. We are a network organization based in Brussels. We represent federations at national, or in some cases at regional level, of housing providers. So the members of our members, in a way, would be single housing cooperatives, public or not-for-profit housing associations on the ground. And we calculate that overall, there are more or less 43,000 of those companies on the ground within our network in 31 countries today. And they manage overall about 24 million homes across Europe, that is, if we include also the UK. It's a very diverse sector, and I will go back to it afterwards in my slide. But as an association, what brings this whole network together, it's the common mission to guarantee affordable housing for all. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about social housing specifically, and to give you some numbers for you to keep in mind. As I said before, the sector is structured in very different ways across the European member states, but it's also of a very different size from one country to another. So if we have some countries like we'll see, maybe this is too small for you to read, but we'll find here on the left of the chart, some countries like the Netherlands, for instance, has the proportionally largest social housing stock in Europe. You have to imagine their social housing, it's almost 1/3 of the overall housing market. And you also have countries with a strong social not-for-profit housing tradition, such as Austria, Denmark, UK or France. But you also have, and this is really actually probably the majority of countries in Europe, some situations where social housing is really a very, very small sector, mainly led by municipalities that own some kind of housing stock themselves, and then they let it to, let's say, the most vulnerable, the most urgent cases. So it's really there's almost a risk by using these words like social housing, not-for-profit housing, of comparing apples and oranges in some cases. But let's say that overall, so if we only look at social rental housing specifically, this is more or less 8% of the housing stock in the European Union. But if we include also cooperatives, for instance, and other types of, let's say, community-led housing initiatives, we're more around 10%. And this is still relatively small overall. So what was mentioned by Amanda before about the fact that most of the housing initiatives are not-for-profit, they're not public. This is also true in Europe, although this is still quite a specific feature for Europe compared to the rest of the world. So what do we do as the Housing Europe Observatory? Housing Europe itself, it's an organization that was established in Brussels, and this is not by chance. It was established in Brussels with a focus on monitoring the impact of legislation and policy initiatives that will come from institutions of the European Union on the housing sector and on the organization it represents. So, of course, the policy work is still the leading part of the organization, but we also work on exchange of good practices and innovation that we do mainly through European, so EU-funded projects. And of course, we have also the observatory, which is in itself a very small research unit. We are based within the secretariat of the organization. And we work on the basis of a number of objectives. It was mentioned already, our core mission is really to support the policy work of Housing Europe by providing evidence and through research findings. It was established with an aim to become leading source of information around housing and especially social and not-for-profit housing in Europe by monitoring data and policies within the sector. When the observatory was set up more than 20 years ago now, I think it was one of the very few organizations looking at housing, social housing specifically, from a European and comparative perspective. This has now changed, as I will mention afterwards. I think in the let's say European environment, there is much more comparative research. There are much more data available than it used to be. Last point that I wanted to highlight: we also try to let's say focus our research on giving concrete outcomes as much as possible, and this means offering to our members, so housing providers on the ground, but also other partners that can be, for instance, local authorities or public authorities involved in housing provision, the opportunity to compare what happens in their context with what happens in other countries in Europe, and also be inspired by concrete examples. So it's something quite different in a way, in the way we work from academic research, because we're mainly driven by the practical outcome and by the policy outcomes. And I will get back to that once again. This is just to mention, we work on a number of different reports and outputs, but our main report is the so-called report on the state of housing in Europe. We've just published the 5th edition at the end of last year. And in this report that we publish every 2 years, we try, first of all, to cover as many European countries as possible. In the last edition, we looked at 20 countries, and we focused on trends and policy developments that particularly affect public, cooperative, and social housing, and also try to put this in the wider context of how housing needs are changing across Europe. What also I wanted to mention, I said before that what we do is something a bit different, of course, from academic research, but we value a lot the inputs from academic research, and we've established a number of cooperation with universities as partners, especially across Europe. So we are members of a network which is called the European Network of Housing Research, or ENHR. You might have heard of it. They also they work on the basis of working groups, and they include also a work strand on housing. So probably many of you might be familiar with that. We also collaborate with universities, especially through EU-funded projects, especially thanks to the Horizon Europe funding line. We've had quite a number of really interesting projects going on, focusing on very different aspects. Many of those are focusing on issues related to, let's say, the energy aspects related to housing, energy efficiency, how to create energy communities, you name it. And recently, there have also been a number of EU-funded projects with a focus more on a housing policy. And again, I will go back to that again. Last point that I wanted to highlight, it's very welcome to have the opportunity to collaborate with this Marie Curie action. It's something that we've experienced before in the past. So just last year was the closing year of another Marie Curie innovative action called Readwell, that focused on delivering affordable and sustainable housing in Europe. And it was a broad network of researchers and academics that put together really a framework to analyze what it means to talk about sustainability and affordability for housing, with very interesting PhD theses from across Europe. And in that context, we were also very lucky to welcome some of the so-called early stage researchers who spent some time at Housing Europe, and it was a way for them to go more into depth into some of their topics from a European perspective, and also to do things like conduct interviews, for instance, with housing providers on the ground. So it was a very enriching experience on all sides, I would say. So I was asked today to talk a bit in broad terms, basically, about this concept of a housing crisis in Europe and how research and policy can work together, or are they working together or not, to try to come up with concrete solutions. And I have to say, so I think as an organization focusing specifically on housing, we've been calling on the European institutions for many years to have a stronger focus on what was happening in the dynamics on the ground. So for us, this crisis has been in the making for a very long time, I would say. Mix of a result of policy choices, market trends, and also one that has many different faces in it, I would say. But it must be said, although for us it's not something new, there is a very new attention at European level on the topic of housing, on issues related to sustainability, affordability, that was not there before. Even if we look back just 2 or 3 years ago, that was a very different political environment. So this is an important time for us as an organization, and for everyone who's working on housing and housing policy across Europe. This crisis, one of the things that is also certain for us is that it's a crisis, but it's affecting different people or different population groups in a different way. And it's also uneven in terms of spatial consequences and spatial distribution. I will go back again to that afterwards, but there's a lot of discussion, for instance, about what should be the specific groups that housing policies should spend more attention on. And of course, this is something that is subject of the debate and different interpretations. And also, in terms of where the crisis is more evident, there has been and there is still a much stronger focus on cities, especially major urban areas in Europe, because this is where we see there is a really strong demand for housing, insufficient supply, and this is driving prices and rents up very quickly. But it should not be forgotten that Europe is indeed, it's not only about European cities. There are so many areas and regions in Europe that are actually maybe even have a decreasing population, but that still have a number of issues related to housing that also must be solved. And of course, as I mentioned before, at this particularly crucial time for us, I think it's what we see is that it's hard to come to an agreement on what are the causes of this so-called European housing crisis, or maybe we should say the many crises that are ongoing, and even more so the solutions that should be put in place. This is just, these images here are actually from the recently adopted European Action Plan on affordable housing that I will go back to in my next slides. But just to say, of course, how this is manifested in reality, we see huge increases in house prices, over the past 10 years. And what is most important, this increase in house prices has definitely outpaced income growth. So while for decades income growth has been one of the drivers indeed of a strong demand for housing, but we see that basically our homes, if you want to put it very shortly, our homes are making more money than our jobs. And this has been the case for at least a decade in many European countries. What we see also is growth of rent, so housing rent, although this is more specifically concentrated in areas of high demand that I was mentioning before. And what we see today is that especially some European cities, I'm thinking, for instance, of Lisbon, Milan, so they are capitals of countries that are not considered to have very high housing costs, but still for people who have to move to the cities today, the housing market and including the rental market has become really overpriced and out of reach. There's also an issue with the supply, especially since COVID. The construction sector has never fully recovered, and it was foreseen by experts that by the end of 2025, we don't have the final figures yet, but it's basically the time of lowest rate of housing construction in Europe for over a decade. So it's true that on the side of supply, there's something to be done indeed to fill this gap. And also issues that are in many cases related to spatial distribution of housing, but that are also linked to speculative practices, let's say. Many homes, although this context, there's a huge demand, many homes are actually not occupied today. So this is an interesting issue. For example, Italy, the country where I come from, has a really high rate of unoccupied homes. You have many of those are in inner regions, mountain regions, especially in southern Italy, that have been strongly depopulated. But you also have many empty homes in central Milan because they have been bought by investors who prefer to keep it empty for a number of years and then sell it when the prices have increased further. So it's a very tricky issue, basically. The new European context that I was mentioning before. So last year, it became very clear that the president of the European Commission had the intention of making housing and affordable housing one of the top priorities for Europe, and she called it a social crisis, and one that tears at Europe's social fabric, that it's important for Europe's future. And this is why the decision was made to start basically going into this issue also from a European perspective, which wasn't the case before, which is not entirely the case even today, because housing policies typically remain a national competence or even a local one. But still, we have things are moving at the European level. And this indeed is why also for the first time in the history of the European Union, we have a specific competence for housing under the European Commissioner who's in charge of the energy policies. You may think it's a strange combination, but actually, let's say one of the most evident impacts from Europe on the housing sector in recent years has been through legislation related to the energy performance of building, which had, because it's a direct competence from Europe, is immediately translated into legislation at the national level. And in this context, at the very end of 2025, the European Commission published a new European Affordable Housing Plan, which is so far, let's say, a framework that shows the importance that Europe gives to this topic, and it also establishes the foundation for further policies to come over the next years. Although for the time being, it doesn't yet, it includes only few, let's say, very concrete initiatives, but still it's supposed to give an input by boosting housing supply, mobilizing investment, and also enabling reforms by the member states to the housing sectors, and also, last point, but very important, protecting the most affected people, the people who are most affected by the housing crisis. So where are we today? Also in terms of what I mentioned before, there has been growing evidence, especially thanks to European and international institutions, but also thanks to collaborations that have been put in place thanks to European funding projects. For example, one of the projects that we're now involved with a number of universities, the University of Dublin, the University of Tilburg, we have Sweden in it, and a number of different of other institutions. It's a very interesting project that has the aim of looking at inequalities in access to housing. And to this goal, they have looked at all existing Eurostat data and started to look into basically the impact of the lack of housing quality or the lack of housing affordability, how this is impacting differently different groups of people according to various criteria. What we found is that so far what is the main, the clearest indicator that makes a difference in terms of housing outcomes for people is actually income, which is not surprising. But just to give you an idea, I literally just copy-pasted here from the website of the project. So this is the incidence of different housing, let's say, problems. So looking at affordability, looking at quality, and looking at insecurity in terms of the length of tenure and so on. This is for the first income quintile, and this is for the fourth income quintile. So what we can see is once again how housing affordability and issues with housing quality are affecting the most low-income people across Europe. There are also a number of other things to be said. Tenants tend to be more affected than owners. At the same time, if we look at countries that have a really high rate of home ownership, there's a phenomenon which is to have people who are considered to be asset rich and income poor. And this means that, for example, they might not have the sufficient income to take care of their homes properly, renovate when the time comes, and have high problems of energy poverty, for instance. So this is one of the things that I wanted to highlight. And this is very important, I would say, also to try to understand indeed who are the most affected people. Like, this is the second point that I was making before. This is just an illustration that there is much more evidence than before available, thanks to a project financed by the ESPON network. This project was concluded last year and has many different aspects to it. But one of the interesting things that we could do thanks to that project was to basically come up with very detailed data available at the local level on housing markets represented by basically what is being advertised by real estate agencies. So thanks to this, we could identify, for instance, in the current housing market, where are the really heated areas where for people it's become really clearly unaffordable to rent or to buy. And this is quite interesting. It's it's very maybe very specific in this context, but it gives some interesting indications and some point at some issues that we might not expect by looking at the typical data available on housing. For instance, if you only focus on national averages in many Eastern European countries, I take Poland, for instance, you would have the idea that the overall people don't have to spend much of their income on housing, but this is because there is a large share of the population who already owns their home and don't even have a mortgage to repay anymore. But if you think of those who are now looking for homes, especially in the capitals, this is really critical also in those countries. So What about housing policies in Europe? So this is an area where we have a lot of knowledge. As I said before, because of the different systems, it's sometimes hard to compare or to come across to come with meaningful comparisons. But what can be said is that definitely, if we look at the social housing sector, this was started being established around the very beginning of the 20th century, often by private initiative that then was taken over by public authorities, especially in the period after the Second World War. So in an effort to rebuild Europe, basically, the public authorities were really active in housing policy and housing supply in many countries. And then housing, as was, let's say, was studied, was mainly the subject of research from a social policy perspective and considered to be the wobbly pillar of the welfare state. And this is because housing was always treated as a right. So people have a right to housing, sometimes enshrined in the constitutions, but it's also a market. So of course there's a tension between these two different elements. Which makes it a bit different from other areas of social policy. There have been, so housing systems have developed in different ways across Europe. One clear indication of that is what I was showing before, the share of social housing, which is varies very significantly across countries. But there have been overall quite similar outcomes or trends over time. And this is one of the clearest points is that from about the mid 1980s, there was a switch. So governments, instead of focusing on supplying homes, public housing programs, not-for-profit housing, there was a switch towards leaving market supply to the housing supply to the market, and instead giving subsidies directly to people who, when they could not afford to buy or to rent homes. And this is quite, I mean, this historically has made a difference and has maybe also contributed to, in some cases, the housing shortages that we see today. This was also accompanied not across Europe, but in a majority of countries by a privatization of social or public housing. And this has also been linked to basically more market finance coming to the sector and increased reliance on capital markets. And for decades, this mainly translated into an increase in home ownership, driven by the availability of mortgage and the low interest rate environment. Today, it's also manifested in what is called the financialization of the housing sector. So basically having big investors coming in and buying parts of the existing housing stock as an investment asset, basically, with potentially very high returns. At the same time, the scope of housing research has also expanded, and we consider now that to give a proper picture of housing policy, you actually have to look at many different aspects and many different areas of policy. So there's, of course, housing supply, but there's also social policy, there's taxation, and urban planning, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a complex issue, and one that really requires looking at it from different perspective, and from a research perspective. This also means bringing in different disciplines to really give a proper picture. Also important, and this is one of the things that we see. So you can, of course, collect evidence, try to interpret it, and to bring this evidence to support policy making. But I think eventually it also is and will always probably remain a very political issue. So policymakers have to make choices, and there will be, in many cases, from their perspective, winners and losers from these political choices. And this, of course, means that housing policy direction is not so straightforward in some cases. Just to mention a few examples of initiatives at the international level that have the specific objective of linking research and policy. There are some institutions which I have to say have really become prominent in this area. For instance, in terms of European institutions, you have the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. They've been publishing excellent reports in recent years on a number of different topics. The latest one looks at the need for housing investment. So trying to take stock of the housing stock that exists compared to population growth at the local and regional level. And indeed, it highlights once again how basically in some areas that are losing population, there might be housing stock that needs to be renovated, in many cases vacant as well, while in urban areas that are attracting an increasing part of the population, there is a growing gap. And also, interestingly, they come up with estimates of how many more homes Europe should build. And we're about today looking at a gap of, well, this is from their perspective, 650,000 homes that basically are not being built every year in Europe that would be needed to fill the existing gap. Also very important in this field, the OECD, over the last decade, they've started working much more intensively on housing from different perspectives. So from the regional studies to social policies, to economic policies, and they have issued a number of really interesting reports, and they also have offered guidance to the countries when it comes to their policy reforms with a specific focus on housing. And this is happening more and more, and something that we see it will also probably increase over the forthcoming years. But this is one of these initiatives that is particularly close to our hearts because we were really one of the driving organizations behind it. So in 5 years ago by now, together with UN Habitat and the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, we launched an initiative. So we work with the government representatives from across this UN region, which is really broad. It includes the whole Europe and also Canada and the US, and looked at basically the driving question was what policy tools are there that have been tested and have proved to be efficient in enhancing housing outcomes in terms of affordability and sustainability. And this initiative, which translated into a report and also an interactive website, looks at 4 key areas, which is governance, so in terms of the different institutions that are involved in housing policy. Land policy, also a really key issue, although one that is sometimes a bit absent from the European policy discourse. Finance and funding to invest in affordable housing and climate neutral housing, so looking at aspects related to sustainability. And this is, for us, was really interesting and a key example of what good cooperation between researchers and policymakers could lead at. Indeed, it resulted in a toolkit which was very much appreciated. And we were very happy to hear that recently, from this experience, the Czech government has been inspired and has established a sort of an expert committee to advise on new policy for affordable housing, which includes some of these recommendations and even some of the researchers and academics that were involved in this phase. So this was for us a very ambitious, but also very practical and very useful initiative that we are hoping to replicate. We're now discussing with UN Habitat and the other agencies for what could be an interesting next phase that ideally should put these recommendations into context and look at the new societal challenges Europe is facing, including, of course, an aging population, and try to basically test the success of the different initiatives. The other project that I wanted to mention, I've already said a few words about it, so I will not go too much in detail, but the data that I showed you before about the, let's say, distribution of housing problems across different income groups, it has very different, 6 different work strands, and one of them is focusing on basically making the link between the research results and policy. And currently, the team is involved in issuing policy snapshots, looking at especially financing solutions that can allow countries to make social housing, not-for-profit housing, financially sustainable over the long term. So just to maybe say a few words more specifically about the topic, which is closer to what you've been working on in the context of the HOMeAGE project. Of course, among the different challenges that we see today, that also have a strong impact on housing, or will have a strong impact on housing in the future, is the issue of aging. And this is something that is also particularly evident in the social housing sector. So the social housing sector typically houses people who are more vulnerable, who have lower income than the average population. And also what we see more and more within our sector, we have many single person households, and an increasing share of those are people 65 plus. And this, of course, is also means that the housing providers themselves have to change the way they're working in this respect. And this has different implications. We have to look at the housing stock. I've seen different reports on this that estimate that about from 70 to 80% of the existing homes in Europe today are not fit, for example, for people who have mobility issues to live in. So in terms of accessibility, this is, of course, something very important, and that we can tackle through having better accessibility standards, but also we have to think of the stock that already exists today, which is, especially in some countries, in really big need of renovation and adaptation. But it's also, it changes a bit the way housing companies have to work, meaning that they more and more go into providing, or at least linking up with organizations that provide care and support services to help people living independently. And this means establishing partnerships, in some cases, new, say, business opportunities that are very interesting. Also, very important, looking also at things like how technology can support these processes. It's also about creating local communities and neighborhoods that can basically help support independent living and create social cohesion, social inclusion. And in some cases, we've done a bit of a scoping exercise with the members of Housing Europe about 5 years ago. And what we saw was basically an increasing number of very interesting projects that look into things like shared living options. So co-housing, intergenerational housing projects. And this is something that is really becoming more and more part of the solutions. What we want to avoid, basically, it's sticking to a situation which is keeping many people, when they grow older, in homes that are not adapted. Sometimes they are too big for their needs, which means they're also very expensive to heat and to maintain, and where they have basically no chances of moving out and finding better solutions because the what is on the market in the meantime is so expensive. So we have to keep this perspective really strongly in mind. And this is also something that I find quite interesting. If we look at the European Housing Plan, which I mentioned before, they look at vulnerable groups, but a strong focus is on young people, which is understandable because I think young persons today is having different, issues to face, like finding a job or finding a home at the same time. But the issues around aging are maybe not yet in part of the European thinking, or not enough to my standards. But it's also important to think that these people, the young people of today, will grow old, hopefully, in the best case scenario in their life. And we will have, I think, a very different situation for for this generation when they're older, in terms of if they had to postpone, for instance, becoming homeowners, if they have been renting throughout their life and at the same time enter a phase where they have to live with pensions that may be lower than what is available today. So I think even taking the perspective of what it means for young people today, taking a long-term perspective and looking what it will change for our societies in the future, this is something really important. This is some of the policy pointers that we found. I think I mentioned those before. So looking at, first of all, analysis of resources, but also needs on the ground, involve inhabitants, involve residents and people to really understand better what they need and what they want, and offer different options, of course, in the housing strategies at the different level, including at the local level, supporting the formation of partnerships between housing providers, but also the social and care services, health services. And also, I think, of course, I think if we think of senior housing, this is also perceived by investors as a huge market opportunity, and it is. But I think if it comes to public support and public finance, we should really advocate for this to focus on initiatives that guarantee affordability and access. And this is also, and this is something where I think we need more research to help us basically making the case for this kind of policy changes. We need to show that public investment in homes that are safe, supportive, that include care and services, can really bring a very high social return for the society, and it can even lead to savings for public authorities over the long term, in terms, for instance, of what they can gain on healthcare costs. So I think I will conclude here. I've spoken a lot for today, but I would be very happy to have a conversation with you and hear your opinions and questions and what you have to say. Thank you.
We're ready to questions if you come up with any yet.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to know what the research about the organization. If you could maybe more descriptively tell us something about your research or methods obviously may be different from the academic research you do, and also maybe a little bit more about the collaboration with the researchers from the universities.
Should I? Yes. Thanks a lot for the question, indeed. So, in terms of the way we work, you have to imagine we have the so-called research team at Housing Europe. We're 2 staff members, but we have the opportunity to work with a wide network. And this means that we tend to work
with it's housing federations, especially those that have in-house data center, research centers, and so on, which means that we have direct access to information that is not readily available as such, as it's not centralized, it's not available as such at European level, which is of course a strong added value for us. We rely a lot on research from third parties. So starting from, let's say, a literature review, but across EU 27 is often, the starting point for what we do. And we also use as data, basically, the results of semi-structured interviews, if you want to call it focus group, but I would say more like a workshop environment where we collect directly the inputs from the organizations on the ground. So probably, I would say in terms of, well, there's also another thing to mention that for a long time, what we did was basically to collect, to also look at data available and try to centralize them, but we don't have a huge capacity in terms of the data analysis as such. Although I know that my colleague, who is an economist, would be actually, up for the challenge, but I don't think it's something that we can do in the structure of two persons. So in terms of methodology, I think it's probably something much more loose, less rigorous than what you have to apply in the context of academic research. And it's also very much conditioned, in many cases, by the urgency of the policy agenda. Because indeed, one of the key questions for us is how much we can afford to go into depth of certain topics when we have a pending request from a ministry that has to put in place a new reform. So you always have to strike a balance between those. But this is also where I think for us it's very important to be able to rely on academic research and the findings. And it's not just for us. I think this is very much valued also by the European institutions. But policymakers need to be, you need to, in a way, pre-digest, I think, some of the research outputs and, make them more readily available for what they have in mind. In this context, something really interesting for us was also to see that the European Commission, when they had to prepare this plan, they issued really broad consultations online where anyone could participate, but they also created an expert group that included a mix of academics and people with different backgrounds, some from civil society organizations, but mainly former ministries, stuff, and so on. So it's, I think in that context, it worked quite well. They actually came up with a list of 74 recommendations, and most of them are really excellent. Many have been taken on board in the actual plan. Not all, not enough maybe, but this is what we saw happening.
Go ahead, Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the overview based on what is going on in the field. As you mentioned, there is 20% of the housing, social housing is unoccupied, and when we're talking about different contributors, we mentioned about cost of house. I wonder if there has been any look into the governance structure and opportunity for participation in this state arrangement for the housing, and then how it contributes to the fact that 20% of it is not being occupied by tenants, and if there is any policy to look into how we can use this opportunity of the participation or collaborative governance to the situation of the and people who choose this one. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the question. So the 20% was referring about the housing stock overall. And I have to say, I have my doubts about it. I think it includes also a lot of, holiday homes, secondary homes that we have to see whether they should be considered as empty or what precisely they should be considered as. Vacancy rates in social housing are typically much lower, where, for example, in France, it's about 5%. I've heard 4% in other contexts. Italy is a case where there's a lot of vacant public housing, unfortunately, and this is really because of the lack of financing for the sector that is not it's not self-sustaining, requires injections of public funding that just hasn't been there for a long time. So when homes are in bad conditions and cannot be renovated, I think there's a lot that could be done on mobilizing those homes, for instance, even through more collaborative ways, for instance, cooperations with the housing cooperatives and so on. But I think overall, so residents' engagement and residents' participation is a topic that we as a federation really try to really push for innovation in this sense. And we had a lot of exchange on this. And I think it's something that we see happening across the sector, although probably slowly. For instance, if you take Belgium, they've just revised the way they have to establish tenants committees and basically the kind of competencies and powers that they have. And it's something that we see happening in other contexts as well. For instance, social housing tends to, let's say, follow a lot of rules. It's something very structured, linked to public policies, but there are also other initiatives which maybe should also be considered as social housing that are more, bottom up. We have examples, for instance, of community land trusts being created. Housing cooperatives are traditionally very strong in some countries, but there's been also an attempt to create new co-ops in other contexts, in Spain, in Portugal recently. So it's something that I think it's coming up really strong. And indeed, it can be seen as an opportunity to renovate and mobilize some of the vacant stock, I think. The question for me is always also where. For instance, the Community Land Trust in Brussels, they are an excellent organization and they really counted on, for instance, donations from private owners who maybe had a building that is not used for years. They renovate it and then they turn it into this kind of community living for very affordable rates, with also the help of public support. But if you take the context, for instance, I'm thinking of a recent conversation with housing cooperatives in Italy that are active on the mountain regions. And there, where they were successful, it's because the local administration was basically helpful to put in place programs that helped with housing, but also helped with, creating social enterprises, local activities to relaunch the local economy. Very bottom up also in this case, and very interesting. But indeed, the issue is how to replicate these good examples more.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and fascinating to see the other projects that have been done in the past and we can link to. You mentioned about the kind of financialization of housing and how this introduces quite a different kind of mentality around housing, and how in the beginning of the kind of 20th century, we had more of that welfare approach and rights-based approach to housing. And I was wondering what your organization has found out about kind of evidence about speculation and speculative behaviors, because I know that in the EU Affordable Housing Plan, this is one of the big evidence gaps. They know that the issue with housing is not just an issue of not enough supply and too much demand. It is an issue of housing being made an asset, and particularly in these high demand areas, there being this financialization on a kind of large and corporate scale. So have you been able to get any data about those kind of speculative behaviors through those federations or through your different partners?
So I think this is an issue that we haven't looked at specifically at Housing Europe Observatory, but we try to look at what others are doing on this. And there's been research from the Joint Research Center. Last year, the Greens group within the European Parliament published a really good report on financialization, and now they want to work more on this topic. So there will be more coming. There's also the whole issue, but maybe it can be slightly for a different entry point of short-term lettings and whether and how they're being monitored. There are data increasingly available thanks to local initiatives that then tend to exchange with each other. So we have an eye on all of this. It's something that it's hard to measure. One of the things, for instance, that has been looked at is the property or the agency of the investors. So how many foreign investors are present in a given market? How many big asset management companies versus the so-called mom and pops landlords or individual. So this, you have to look at it from very different perspectives. But just to give you an example, because I was listening to a presentation by one of the authors of this report for the Greens from a couple of years ago. And I think this is also a risk, to be honest, with the new housing plan, which is a good foundation, but it's very open to interpretation. So they have this concept of affordable housing, for which they're hoping to attract a lot of private investment, which is per se, of course, is needed. You need investment to fill the supply gap. At the same time, he was showing the example of a German, what is it called? Real asset fund that I will not name, but they had investment in real estate, both single-family homes and multifamily buildings, and they were looking at returns on investment of 13 to 15%. This is huge. Even in systems where the social housing rents are not, the lowest, because people have access to housing benefits that can help with that. But there are enough to guarantee the sustainability of the not-for-profit companies over time. They're looking at a 3% annual return. So where are we going to find this private investment that is accepting a 3% instead of 15%? Is an open question for me. But there are hopefully initiatives in this sense, also thanks to ESG investments type of taxonomy and so on. But it's a question mark.
And hello, everybody, very much. Thank you for the presentation and a very practical question. Since the talk was about researchers and policymakers and kind of collaborations, I was going to ask, how can we as PhD researchers, for example, collaborate with you as Housing Europe or similar organizations such as Eurocities, for example? Would it make sense to kind of send you our papers? Probably not. So is there a way our findings can be taken up in your uni report, for example, or something like that?
I would say at least abstracts are very much welcome. Maybe not the full papers directly, because it's just the two of us. No, thank you for the question. Maybe I would be extremely happy and grateful to keep in touch after this conference and to know more about precisely what you're looking at. And we have, I think, in this case, one of the most immediate points that we can highlight is that we can help with the dissemination and visibility. We have an excellent communication team, so we're active on social media. We have a blog which hosted in the past many academics who were willing to give a short think piece on a topic of their choice, and also anything that indeed can be translated into, let's say, practical suggestions to housing providers themselves as to what can really improve their work, maybe even bring more efficiency, better outcomes. We regularly organize a number of events with our members where we're happy to have research findings presented.
Thank you, Lisa, for the presentation. I do a bit of work with one of your members, the Irish Council for Social Housing, and I'm a member there. And I think one of the things that we're becoming more conscious of is that we're not just providing housing, but we're building communities. And a lot of the data that we see today is much more purely quantitative around the numbers of units and the sizes and the topography of the units. Do you see Housing Europe and that being able to help, I suppose, create the conditions that we might be able to get more qualitative data around community cohesion and community value?
Well, thank you very much for the question, because this for us is a key topic. So basically, this translate, I mean, into, if we have to think in policy terms, is how to best show the full added value, which is not just about, you know, providing bricks and mortars, as we used to say. In this sense, we've, for instance, we've looked at the different ways in which housing associations across Europe, in the different, you know, legal forms that they have and so on, try to evaluate their and assess their impact. And these are very diverse, but it's something that has been, it's a real need for the sector as a whole. And there are more and more experiences around. It has to vary from one country to another, because you have to think, for instance, I think the UK were quite pioneers in this idea of showing the social impact, social added value. But housing associations there typically have a lot of different activities. They even, you know, create sister companies to provide care services and so on. This is something that doesn't happen across Europe. Some countries, really, housing associations can only do housing, and then they have to, you know, figure out ways to cooperate with other services providers and so on. But I think definitely this is a real gap, and I think one where research can really help us. So, as I said before, it would be really welcome if we could do more to show this impact, this added value.
Questions? Your last sentence was that the housing associations can engage in social services or health services. But do the cooperatives, can they do more? Like, can this legal form of housing, the cooperatives, do more of social participation events or something? Like, I think they can. So maybe, what do you think about the cooperation? I know that the cooperatives, you also issued the report on cooperatives in Europe, I think, and Housing Europe. So.
No, I think it's one of the very interesting characteristics, and I think the co-ops in general are hard to, how can I say, to communicate to sometimes to outside stakeholders. But this, for me, is one of the key points. For instance, I was talking to one of our members from Sweden recently, and he was saying that basically they organize what the tenants decide to organize in terms of joint activities, leisure classes. So it's really the democratic decision principle that can have I think it can have a really strong impact. Now, what I meant as a reply before is more, it's really about, the legal boundaries of the type of activities one can engage with. But even, for instance, housing companies that typically are, the municipality sets up a company in charge of managing the housing stock, but then they actually have a role to play in, making sure that the local authorities organize a better coordination with the other services provision around it. And I think it's something that they can even go far in stretching what they can do to achieve that. And that's because of catering for specifically vulnerable groups and vulnerable people. It's the only way to create sustainable local communities.
Wonderful, great. Yes.
just finally, you've alluded to some of the things that you maybe think are missing from the EU Affordable Housing Plan. Could you please tell us more about what kind of Housing Europe's position is on the framework as it stands and the key things that maybe are missing or need to be developed moving forward?
Do we have another hour? Because this is a risky question. I think, no, look, let's, like, for us, maybe the two tricky points to keep in mind, of course, the public, social, and cooperative housing, not just as, you know, a little side thing, but to really think in terms of this can really be the core of policy delivery on the ground, because we have examples out there where it's like this is the way it works. Move away from so work on supply, but basically move away from the idea of just build, build, build. This is something that we heard as a slogan as such, because it may not deliver the type of homes we want, where we want, at the costs that people can afford. And this is maybe the most complicated. Try to strike a balance to the European, you know, willingness to support, but keeping in mind the national and local competence, because I think there's a risk if Europe comes in with kind of blanket solutions that are supposed to, you know, work for everyone. This really may not be the case. So I think these will be, for the time being, and of course, more money for the sector, but we're all asking for that here in Brussels. So.
Anybody else? We have 1 more minute. Let me just throw in a question that might be not covered yet from the DRs. And I was wondering how the role of evidence-based research changes across all levels, like local versus national versus EU, and you know what kind of evidence travels really well between all three, or if they need to choose one to focus somehow differently.
It's a very good question. So I think at European level, because of the need to support, you know, large programs with maybe few objectives, there will always be a tendency to go towards more quantitative indicators, you know, striking figures, like what I was saying before. We need 600,000 whatever homes being built every year.
It's very low, right? It's really low. It's what they say. It's not real.
Also very low, but it's on the. But the point is that what I was saying before, because of its subsidiarity is important, because the local reality is what will make a difference in the end. I think. The local level is where we can have probably more interesting evaluation of policies that exist, and also the different interactions. So just to give you one example, we were talking to actually Irish government representatives the other day, and they were saying that in the new housing strategy, I'm not sure how it's called, but they want to include this time a stronger infrastructure aspect. So thinking of housing, not just housing, but also basically the preparation of infrastructure around it, going from, you know, water, electricity, but also transports. And I think we have to think in these terms, which are very integrated, but they're hard. The higher level you go, the more the nuances are lost. So, but I think from really good local level research, we can still extrapolate messages that can have an impact at all levels.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Elite. That's the last question then. So thank you really so much for this broad coverage on the state of the housing within Europe, predominantly, but also how it affects older people, of course, and the necessary role of research. And how to come up with those solutions. So it's been really interesting and helpful. So thank you again, Alice.